All right, so we talked a little bit about some characteristics of parasites and their hosts. Now we want to translate that into the ecological dynamics, not just of how a parasite consumes a host, but also how parasitism then influences the host population dynamics and the dynamics of the parasite population. All right, so let's go talk about that, and also then clearly all of the success of a parasite population and a host population is going to be determined by the parasite's ability to infect that host. So let's go talk about that next. All right, so this picture is the perfect tool for describing a whole pile of ways that parasites move around. The first thing that I want to talk about is horizontal transmission. And horizontal transmission is when a parasite moves between individuals other than parents and their offspring. So here you can see they're describing horizontal transmission among species, where a snail is transferring a parasite, a helminth parasite to a frog. This is what Dr. Kaprivnikar studies actually, and that frog then transmits the parasite to a great blue heron, and then maybe the heron in its bird droppings transfers it back to the snail. The other thing that horizontal transmission could be is within a species. So horizontal transmission could occur between individuals of the same species as long as they are not parent and offspring. So they could just be hanging out in the same spot, and then we end up seeing the transfer of, say, bird flu. Now, there can also be vertical transmission, and vertical transmission is from parent to offspring. So in this case, they're showing that chlamydia can be transferred between parent and offspring. It's one option. Plants often have fungal endophytes that live in their tissues, and those endophytes often get transferred to offspring right when the seed is being formed, in fact. And then sometimes horizontal transmission can occur, I forgot to do this one, when it is passed between individuals of the same species or different species through a vector. And a vector is any organism that a parasite uses to disperse itself from one host to another. Now, this includes a whole pile of species, and we're assuming sort of that most of these will express some form of disease after being infected by the parasite. But in fact, not all species express symptoms of having a parasite. So there can be what we call reservoir species, and these species are ones that carry the parasite but do not succumb to the disease that the parasite can cause in another species. So often helminth parasites may have absolutely no effect in the bird, but have really significant and serious consequences for both the frog and the snail. Okay, so that's another. So those are some key definitions that you'll hear come up as we're walking through this module. I hope it's helpful. All right, so now that we've learned how transmission occurs and what it does to a host, whether it kills them or whether it just weakens them, that is going to influence. Being infected with a parasite is going to influence your ability to reproduce and survive. And when you change reproduction and survival, all of a sudden you're talking about population dynamics. And the very cool thing is that we can watch how host populations and parasite populations change in abundance through time, and they do so in cycles. I think we've talked about cycles before when we were talking about predator-prey dynamics, and the same sort of patterns happen here as well. So let's go chat about that. All right, I bet you have seen these fuzzy little guys. They cover a tree in the summer, often in the late summer. They're super fuzzy, but what you will see is mounds of them, huge numbers of them congregating in one tree. They'll spin a web, and they will, within that web, eat every single green thing that is in the web completely, so there's nothing left. In some cases, they can entirely defoliate a tree. Well, it turns out these forest tent caterpillars have population dynamics that fluctuate. They're considered an ectoparasite to trees, and they fluctuate in their population sizes in radical ways. So they have outbreaks in some years and then very minimal populations in other years. This has happened over and over and over again, and we can see in these 3 sites that were measured repeatedly in Ontario how repeatedly they are, and how it happens almost at the same time between the 3 sites for each of the 3 populations, even though these populations aren't largely interacting with each other. The moth populations can, and so they can move, and so when there's an outbreak, they move and cover everything. So there it is. There is a cycle again where the populations of tent caterpillars have outbreaks and then go under control. Here's another example of cycles, population cycles, where measles has outbreaks on a regular basis. So measles, before a vaccination occurred, we saw measles outbreaks happening every 5 years or so, no, every 2 years or so. You can see how common they were, and you can imagine, now that we have gone through a pandemic, how disruptive that would be to your life if you are trying to avoid getting access to measles. Of course, many people did not avoid measles and suffered the consequences. Measles causes very high temperatures, they can cause death, and they often cause blindness in people if they don't die from the very high fever. So this was a massive impact on our populations. By 1964, the vaccination program began for measles, and what you can see is that as more and more of the population became vaccinated, all of a sudden those fluctuations in population size dimmed repeatedly, so that it was much less of the population was influenced, and eventually these are very small outbreaks that only occur in unvaccinated populations at this point. Now, what this then gave people the idea of was trying to figure out how to model how to model disease. And so one of the models that has come up as a repeatedly used and very handy tool to understand what disease transmission will occur is to use the susceptible, infected, and resistance model. All right, so let's imagine there's a population that has never been exposed to a particular disease. You could imagine this might be COVID a year or so ago, 2 years ago. So most of the population has not been infected before, and so we're all susceptible. 100% of people were susceptible. And as people become infected, which will be described by the purple, you can see that the number of susceptible individuals declines. Now, as this goes through the disease dynamics, some infected individuals will become recovered, and some and we see fewer and fewer susceptible individuals as recovered individuals return to health. Of course, this graph is misleading because it suggests that 100% of individuals will recover, which we know is unlikely in most disease conditions. However, what's interesting is that at this point, when we start to see recovered individuals, those people whose immune system has been primed to be able to resist the disease will then acquire some immunity. And we, in fact, have seen some immunity, some limited immunity in COVID individuals, but we are not sure of the duration of that immunity, how long it will last, even still. But so once we see increasing numbers of the population recover and acquire immunity, then we will see fewer and fewer infected individuals. This was the model that was adopted by the American political system up until the January transfer of power to Biden. And what they didn't realize in this model was the idea that, yes, anyone who is infected and survives will become part of that recovered individuals group. But what they didn't realize was that in some cases, up to 10 or 20% of people were not recovering. And so there is this significant portion of the population that is lost to death because of a disease. And so while this is a fantastic model for understanding what will happen through the introduction of a new disease, it is not one we want to emulate, and we all know that infection involves a significant amount of suffering. And with that, I'm ending here, and we'll go on to the next module.